The humid Miami air hung heavy over the farmer's market, the sun dipping lower as vendors called out their closing sales. Ethan Rivera adjusted his backpack, crammed with notes and a half-eaten sandwich he'd barely had time to touch between hospital shifts. He weaved through the crowd, exhaustion evident in his hurried steps, but he paused to buy his grandmother's favorite papayas. She'd been unwell lately, and this small gesture was his way of staying connected amid his chaotic schedule. As Ethan handed a few crumpled bills to the vendor, a commotion caught his attention. A woman, impeccably dressed in a cream linen blouse and tailored pants, wavered near a display of orchids. Her hand trembled as she reached for a pillar to steady herself, her pale face stark against the vibrant flowers. She collapsed moments later, the sound of her hitting the pavement breaking through the murmur of the crowd. Ethan dropped his bag and ran toward her, his medical instincts overriding his fatigue. Kneeling beside her, he quickly checked her pulse, strong but rapid. Her breathing was shallow, her lips parted as if to speak but unable to form words. Around them, onlookers gathered, whispering about calling an ambulance. Ethan raised his voice, steady but firm, directing someone to grab water while another held a shaded umbrella to block the oppressive sun. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he asked, his tone calm despite the adrenaline surging through him. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing stormy gray eyes that seemed as much puzzled as weak. She managed a faint nod. Minutes later, with water pressed to her lips, the woman began to regain her composure. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice low and refined, though tinged with embarrassment. She attempted to sit up, but Ethan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Not so fast," he said, his tone light but firm. "You fainted. You need to rest." "I'm fine," she insisted, though her hand trembled as she reached for her designer bag. "I was just careless with my schedule." Her French accent lilted slightly, betraying her roots. Ethan didn't budge, his brow furrowed. "You're dehydrated. Have you eaten today?" "Perhaps not," she admitted with a ghost of a smile, but her pride wouldn't allow more. The ambulance, when called off by the woman herself, left Ethan bemused but determined. He insisted on staying by her side until she felt steady enough to walk. "What's your name?" he asked as they sat on a shaded bench, the crowd dissipating around them. "Delphine," she said after a pause, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Delphine Moreau." "I'm Ethan," he replied, watching her cautiously. She exuded elegance, every detail of her appearance meticulously curated, from her understated gold earrings to her sleek bob that framed her sharp cheekbones. Yet there was something weary in her gaze, a guardedness that made him wonder what lay beneath her polished exterior. "I owe you my gratitude," she said, turning to meet his eyes. "You handled that situation with such care." "Are you a doctor?" "Not quite," Ethan said with a modest shrug. "I'm a medical intern. Long hours, no pay, glamorous stuff like that." His tone carried a touch of humor, but the exhaustion etched on his face betrayed the weight of his responsibilities. Delphine tilted her head slightly, as if appraising him. "And yet you stopped to help a stranger when you could have walked away." He looked at her, puzzled by her intensity. "That's just what you do," he said simply, brushing off the compliment. She reached into her bag and produced her wallet. "I insist you let me repay you," she said. Ethan hesitated, the card hovering between them like an unspoken question. "That's not necessary," he said, standing and slipping his backpack onto one shoulder. "I'm just glad you're okay." She then took an ivory business card, embossed with her name and a number in gold script. "Then dinner, perhaps? Or something for your family? You mentioned no pay, surely there is something you need." "Here, take my card," she pressed, placing the card on the bench beside him when he didn't reach for it. "You've done me a kindness, and I'd like to return it." He finally relented, tucking the card into his pocket with a polite nod. "Take care of yourself, Delphine," he said, offering her a small, genuine smile before walking away. As he made his way home, Ethan couldn't help but replay the encounter in his mind. There was something magnetic about Delphine, something that didn't quite add up. Her gratitude seemed sincere, yet her demeanor hinted at a woman accustomed to control. The way she had downplayed her fainting spell, brushing off assistance as if vulnerability was a luxury she couldn't afford, lingered in his thoughts. When he arrived at the small apartment he shared with his grandmother, the scent of her arroz con pollo greeted him, but his thoughts remained preoccupied. Over dinner, he told her about the strange woman at the market, skimming over details but mentioning the card she'd given him. His grandmother, ever the practical matriarch, arched a brow. "You should call her. A woman like that doesn't give her number to just anyone." Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "She was just being polite. She gave you her card, Mijo. That means she wants you to use it." He glanced at the card on the counter, its gilded lettering catching the warm glow of the kitchen light. "I don't know. She doesn't seem like the type who does anything casually. And you don't seem like the type who lets a good opportunity slip through his fingers," his grandmother countered with a knowing smile. "At least hear what she has to say." As the evening wore on, Ethan found himself staring at the card. Finally, he tucked the card into the worn pages of his medical notes, telling himself he'd think about it tomorrow. Yet even as he tried to focus on his studies, the image of Delphine, both fragile and indomitable, lingered like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The sunlight filtering through the expansive windows of Delphine Moreau's penthouse cast a golden hue over the marble floors. Every inch of her home spoke of refinement, from the modern art adorning the walls to the sleek furniture curated with precision. Yet beneath the polished veneer of her surroundings lay a woman who thrived in a world where power was currency and control was the only rule she trusted. Delphine lounged in a velvet armchair, her silk robe draped loosely over her shoulders, as her assistant, Sylvie, read aloud the latest legal update. The tension in her jaw was the only indication of the storm brewing inside her. The lawsuit filed by former investors had gained traction, threatening to unearth the cracks in her cosmetics empire. For decades, she had built her brand into a global powerhouse, known as much for its groundbreaking products as for the enigma of the woman behind it. "They think they can corner me," Delphine said, her voice cold and deliberate. "Let them try. I didn't rise to the top by being naive." Sylvie hesitated, her gaze flicking nervously to the tablet in her hands. "The board is growing restless. Some of them are already aligning with Charles to challenge your control." At the mention of her nephew, Delphine's lips tightened. She had once admired Charles's ambition, but his willingness to play dirty to seize power was a betrayal she hadn't anticipated. "Charles is a child playing with matches," she said dismissively. "I have no intention of letting him burn down what I've built." As Sylvie exited the room, Delphine picked up her phone, scrolling through the contacts until she reached a name that had occupied her thoughts since the farmer's market. Ethan Rivera. The young man had reached out finally, it was time for the next step. Later that evening, Ethan stood outside the entrance to a restaurant that oozed understated luxury. The card Delphine had given him weighed heavily in his pocket, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stepped into something far outside his comfort zone. Inside, Delphine was already seated at a private table, her presence commanding yet effortlessly composed. "You came," she said as he approached, her expression neutral but her sharp eyes observing his every move. "I figured it wouldn't hurt to have dinner," Ethan replied, sitting across from her. He looked out of place in the setting, his worn leather bag slung over his shoulder, a stark contrast to her immaculate appearance. Delphine didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Well, I must admit since our little accident my thoughts went a little beyond dinner and I would like to discuss another proposition with you." "I'll get straight to the point," she began, folding her hands on the table. "I need a husband." Ethan blinked, certain he had misheard her. "I'm sorry, what?" "A husband," she repeated, her tone unwavering. "It's not about love or companionship. It's business." Ethan leaned back, stunned into silence. "Is this a joke?" "It's anything but," Delphine replied calmly. She explained the bylaws of her company, detailing how her marital status could determine the future of her empire. The board is already circling like vultures. If I don't act decisively, I risk losing everything I've worked for. Ethan shook his head, trying to process what he was hearing. And you think I'm the solution? We barely know each other. That's precisely why you're ideal, she said. You have no ties to my world, no agenda. You're independent, intelligent, and, frankly, you're in a position where this arrangement could benefit you as well. He stiffened, her words hitting too close to home. What do you mean by that? You're drowning in debt, she said matter-of-factly. Your grandmother's medical bills are piling up, and your career is just beginning. I can take care of all of it, your loans, her treatment, anything you need. In return, you agree to this marriage for 2 years. Ethan felt his stomach tighten, anger flaring at her audacity. So you've done your homework on me. Delphine didn't flinch. I don't make offers without knowing the details. This isn't personal, Ethan. It's a business proposal, and one that would benefit us both. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You want me to sell myself so you can keep control of your company? That's insane. Think of it as a partnership, she said smoothly, ignoring his tone. A contract between two parties with aligned interests. You get financial freedom and security for your family. I get what I need to protect my company. And what happens after 2 years? He asked, his skepticism evident. We part ways, she said simply. No strings attached. You'll be free to live your life however you choose. Ethan stared at her, searching for any sign that she wasn't completely serious. But her expression remained steady, her confidence unshaken. It unnerved him how composed she was, as though this proposition were as routine as a business merger. This is a lot, he said finally, running a hand through his hair. You can't seriously expect me to just agree to something like this. I expect you to think it over, she replied, her voice softening slightly. I understand it's unconventional. But sometimes, the unconventional solution is the most effective. Her calm demeanor only fueled his frustration. Do you even care what kind of position this puts me in? How I'm supposed to explain this to my family, my friends? Ethan, she said, leaning forward slightly, her gaze intent. I'm offering you a way out of a life that's been nothing but struggle. I'm not asking you to change who you are, just to play a role for a limited time. If it doesn't sit right with you, walk away. But if you choose to accept, you'll gain more than you're losing. He stared at her, torn between the weight of her offer and the unease it stirred in him. Delphine radiated control, a woman who bent the world to her will, and yet there was something almost desperate beneath her polished exterior. The thought of entering into such an arrangement felt wrong, but the idea of rejecting the opportunity felt even worse. As he left the restaurant that night, her card felt heavier in his pocket than before. Delphine had offered him a lifeline, but it came tethered to a world he didn't understand and wasn't sure he wanted any part of. Still, as he walked into the humid Miami night, one question echoed in his mind: could he afford to say no? Delphine's voice was calm and deliberate as she explained the stakes, her every word chosen with the precision of someone used to commanding attention. The bylaws of my company were written decades ago by men who couldn't imagine a woman running an empire like mine, she said, her gaze fixed on Ethan across the polished table in her penthouse dining room. To ensure I retain majority control, those same bylaws require me to be married. If I don't meet this condition, my voting power shifts to the board. Ethan's head spun as he tried to process her explanation. The luxurious surroundings only heightened his discomfort. He couldn't reconcile the sheer opulence of her life with the predicament she was describing. That's archaic, he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Why not fight it in court? Delphine sighed, tapping her perfectly manicured nails on the edge of her glass. I could, but that would take years. Time I don't have. The board is already scheming to push me out. I can't afford to give them an inch. And you think a marriage of convenience is the answer? Ethan asked, his tone incredulous. That's your solution? Her expression didn't falter. It's the most efficient solution. A practical arrangement with clear terms. No emotion, no entanglement, just business. Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. This is insane. You don't even know me. I know enough, Delphine countered. You're trustworthy, intelligent, and independent. And, most importantly, you're not a threat. That makes you ideal. He laughed, though there was no humor in it. So I'm a safe choice. How flattering. Delphine ignored the jab, her focus unshaken. We would sign a prenup, of course. It would ensure that neither of us has any claims on the other's assets. Separate lives, separate finances. All I need is the appearance of stability. Ethan rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the conversation settle heavily on his shoulders. And what happens after you get what you need? After 2 years or however long this is supposed to last? We part ways, Delphine said simply. You leave with your debts paid, your family's needs taken care of, and no strings attached. It's a transactional arrangement. Nothing more. The idea of entering such an agreement made Ethan's stomach churn. It felt wrong, like crossing an invisible line he hadn't even realized existed. And yet, as he thought about the crushing weight of his student loans and his grandmother's mounting medical bills, a part of him couldn't dismiss it outright. That night, Ethan sat on the worn couch in his small apartment, the conversation with Delphine replaying in his mind. His best friend, Logan, lounged beside him, nursing a beer and watching him with a mix of curiosity and concern. So, let me get this straight, Logan said, setting his bottle down on the coffee table. This woman, this stranger, wants to marry you to keep control of her company. And in exchange, she's offering to solve all your financial problems? Ethan nodded, staring at the frayed edge of the rug. Pretty much. And you're actually considering it? Logan asked, disbelief coloring his tone. What choice do I have? Ethan shot back, his frustration bubbling to the surface. I'm drowning, Logan. Every month it's another bill I can't pay, another reminder that I can't do enough for my family. This could change everything. But at what cost? Logan pressed. You'd be selling yourself, Ethan. That's not who you are. Ethan sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. I know how it sounds. I hate that I'm even thinking about it. But this isn't just about me. It's about my grandmother, my future. If I walk away from this, I'll be stuck in the same cycle forever. Logan studied him for a moment, his expression softening. I get it, man. I do. But just promise me you'll think this through. Don't let her back you into a corner. Ethan nodded, though his mind was already made up. He would think about it, agonize over it, more like, but the reality was inescapable. Delphine's offer wasn't just an opportunity, it was a way out of the crushing weight of his life. The next morning, he called Delphine and asked to meet. She greeted him at her penthouse with the same composed demeanor as before, offering him a seat at the dining table where the sunlight streamed in through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I've decided to accept, Ethan said, the words feeling foreign as they left his mouth. But I have conditions. Delphine arched a brow, intrigued. I'm listening. First, the prenup, he said firmly. It has to cover everything. No surprises, no loopholes. I'm not signing up for this unless I know exactly what I'm getting into. Done, Delphine said without hesitation. What else? Separate lives, Ethan continued. I'm not pretending to be something I'm not. If people ask, we keep it simple. No lies, no theatrics. Agreed, Delphine said. Anything else? Ethan hesitated, then added, I need assurances that this won't come back to haunt me. If this goes south, I don't want my name dragged through the mud. Delphine nodded, her expression serious. You have my word. Though her calmness unnerved him, Ethan pushed his doubts aside. He had made his choice, and now he had to see it through. As he left her penthouse, the weight of the decision settled on him fully. He felt a strange mix of guilt and resolve, knowing he had compromised a piece of himself but hoping it was worth the cost. That evening, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, staring at the paperwork Delphine had sent over. It was all there in black and white, the terms of the agreement, the promises she had made, the clear boundaries that would define their arrangement. And yet, as he signed his name at the bottom of the contract, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something far more complicated than he could imagine. It was a decision made out of necessity, a choice between his pride and his family's well-being. And as much as he hated it, Ethan knew he couldn't look back. The courthouse was nearly silent, the echo of footsteps punctuating the emptiness of the marble halls. Ethan adjusted his tie, his palms damp despite the air-conditioned chill. Across from him, Delphine sat poised in a tailored navy dress, her hair pinned back with meticulous precision. She appeared calm, almost detached, as though this were a meeting about a business merger rather than a wedding. The judge presiding over the ceremony read the vows with the monotony of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. Ethan stole a glance at Delphine, who responded with a faint, polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. To his left, Delphine's assistant Sylvie stood with a clipboard in hand, her expression as impassive as her employer's. On the other side, her lawyer, Mr. Hargrove, looked mildly bored, checking his watch between glances at the paperwork. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan felt a strange hollowness in the pit of his stomach. There was no celebration, no exchange of rings, just a handshake between Delphine and Hargrove as they finalized the legalities. She turned to Ethan and extended her hand, her grip firm but impersonal. "Welcome to the arrangement," she said softly, her tone laced with the kind of professionalism that made it clear she meant every word. Later that day, Ethan arrived at her mansion, a sprawling estate nestled in Miami's most exclusive neighborhood. The iron gates opened to reveal a long driveway lined with palm trees, leading to a house that resembled an art museum more than a home. The facade, made of sleek white stone, gleamed under the afternoon sun. Ethan stepped out of the car, his suitcase in hand, and stared up at the towering structure. It was as impressive as it was intimidating. Delphine greeted him at the door, gesturing for a housekeeper to take his bags. "Your room is on the east wing," she said as they entered the grand foyer. The space was immaculate, with marble floors and a crystal chandelier that refracted light onto the walls. "You'll find everything you need there. Dinner is at 7 sharp." Ethan nodded, unsure of what else to say. The housekeeper led him down a corridor that seemed to stretch on forever, past rooms with closed doors and priceless artwork. When they finally reached his quarters, Ethan stepped inside to find a space that could have belonged to royalty. The bedroom was massive, with a king-sized bed draped in white linens, a sitting area with plush armchairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the estate's gardens. Despite the luxury, the room felt cold, as though it had been staged for a magazine shoot rather than lived in. He set his suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't just a new chapter, it was an entirely different book, one he wasn't sure he belonged in. The first few days passed uneventfully, but the cracks in the arrangement began to show quickly. Delphine's need for control revealed itself in subtle yet persistent ways. She insisted that Ethan provide her with a detailed itinerary of his day, citing the need to maintain appearances for anyone who might inquire about their relationship. "It's not about prying," she explained over breakfast one morning. "It's about consistency. If someone asks me what you're doing, I need to be able to answer without hesitation." Ethan bit back a retort, choosing instead to nod and focus on his plate. He didn't want to argue, but the constant updates felt intrusive. She'd even gone so far as to suggest he limit his outings to locations she deemed appropriate. When he mentioned wanting to visit his grandmother on a day she hadn't accounted for, Delphine raised an eyebrow. "It's important we maintain a routine," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Spontaneity can lead to questions we don't want." Her reasoning made sense, but it didn't make it any easier to swallow. Ethan felt the walls closing in, the freedom he thought he'd gained slipping further from reach. The financial relief was real, his debts were being handled, and his grandmother's medical care had vastly improved, but the cost of that relief weighed heavily on him. In the evenings, they dined at opposite ends of a long mahogany table, the silence between them punctuated only by the clinking of silverware. Delphine remained composed, discussing work matters or offering curt observations about the news. Ethan, on the other hand, found himself retreating into his thoughts, wondering how he had ended up here. One night, after yet another stilted dinner, he wandered the halls of the mansion, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. The house felt like a museum, filled with beautiful things but devoid of warmth. He passed closed doors and locked rooms, each one adding to the sense of alienation he couldn't shake. It wasn't just the physical space that felt unwelcoming, it was the arrangement itself, the imbalance of power that left him feeling small and insignificant. Ethan tried to remind himself why he had agreed to this. His grandmother's health had improved dramatically with the private care Delphine had arranged, and the stress of looming bills had lifted. Yet, every time Delphine handed him a schedule or reminded him of an obligation, he felt like a pawn in her meticulously crafted game. Despite her composed exterior, there were moments when Ethan caught glimpses of something deeper in Delphine. Once, while passing her office late at night, he saw her sitting at her desk, her head in her hands. The sight was so out of character that he paused, wondering if he should knock. Before he could decide, she straightened and resumed typing, her posture as rigid as ever. Their interactions continued in this strange push and pull, her controlling demeanor clashing with his growing frustration. But no matter how much he bristled at her demands, Ethan couldn't deny the logic behind them. Every time he felt the urge to push back, he reminded himself of the sacrifices she was making, even if they were transactional. As weeks turned into months, Ethan adjusted to the rhythm of his new life, though the tension never fully eased. He followed her schedules, provided the updates she requested, and played the role of the devoted husband when necessary. Yet, in the quiet moments, he couldn't help but wonder if he had traded one set of struggles for another, more gilded kind. Ethan stood by the windows of his room one evening, looking out at the meticulously manicured gardens below. The life he had stepped into felt surreal, like he was living someone else's story. He thought of his grandmother, her laughter returning as her health improved, and told himself it was worth it. For now, at least, he could endure. Ethan had settled into a routine at the mansion, though settled felt like too strong a word for the uneasy rhythm he lived by. Delphine had a way of turning even the simplest interactions into a transaction. He complied with her demands for regular updates and endured the sterile atmosphere of the house, all while telling himself he could stomach anything for the sake of his grandmother's care. But his discomfort turned to unease one afternoon when he stumbled upon a conversation not meant for his ears. Returning from a run, Ethan passed Delphine's office, its door left slightly ajar. Her voice carried into the hallway, low but sharp. "I told you, Sylvie, it had to be him. The others weren't suitable." Sylvie's response was quieter, but her tone hinted at concern. "And you're certain this won't come back to haunt you?" Ethan froze, sweat cooling uncomfortably on his skin. He stepped closer, his heart pounding as he strained to hear more. "It won't," Delphine replied curtly. "I've ensured everything is in place. The meeting wasn't chance, Sylvie. Nothing I do is." The words hit Ethan like a blow. He backed away silently, his mind racing. The meeting at the farmer's market, her fainting spell, hadn't been a coincidence. She'd orchestrated the entire encounter, and now, with a single overheard exchange, Ethan's perception of her had shifted. His instincts told him to barge in and demand answers, but something held him back. If she had lied about this, what else was she hiding? That night, Ethan's thoughts churned as he lay in his expansive yet unwelcoming room. Every interaction with Delphine replayed in his mind, her poised demeanor now colored by suspicion. The polished confidence she wore like armor seemed less admirable and more calculated. He resolved to stay alert, to observe carefully before confronting her. If there was more to her plan, he needed to understand it fully before making any moves. The following week, Ethan found himself on edge, watching Delphine more closely. Her behavior hadn't changed, but now every comment, every instruction, felt laden with ulterior motives. The unease grew when he overheard another conversation, this time between Delphine and her lawyer, Mr. Hargrove. It happened as he walked past the library late one evening, the light spilling into the dim corridor. "The documents are nearly ready," Hargrove was saying. "But I must emphasize the importance of waiting. A couple of years, at least." "And you're certain this timeline is legally sound?" Delphine asked, her tone as composed as ever. "Completely," Hargrove assured her. "But I have to ask, is the guy under control?" Ethan felt a chill run through him as Delphine laughed softly. "Oh, Hargrove. He's docile. There's nothing to worry about." He didn't stay to hear the rest. His hands trembled as he gripped the banister, his mind a storm of indignation and confusion. Docile. The word echoed in his ears, an insult disguised as an assessment. He'd thought their arrangement, odd as it was, had been built on some level of mutual respect. Instead, he was a piece on her chessboard, someone she could manipulate at will. It was a humiliation he hadn't anticipated, and it cut deep. The next morning, Delphine greeted him at breakfast with the same detached politeness she always displayed, her demeanor a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within him. He played along, keeping his responses brief while his mind worked to unravel her motives. If her meeting him hadn't been a coincidence, if she needed years for some kind of transaction, then what exactly had she drawn him into? And why? Ethan began piecing together a strategy. He needed answers, but confrontation without evidence would only give Delphine the upper hand. His curiosity pushed him to tread carefully, to gather more information before making his move. She was too calculated, too prepared. If he wanted to outmaneuver her, he needed to understand the rules of her game. He started by paying closer attention to the details of the house. The staff, though polite, seemed distant, their interactions with him carefully minimal. He noticed Sylvie's nervous glances during meetings with Delphine and the way she avoided him when they crossed paths. Even the lawyer, Hargrove, who had once treated him as a casual afterthought, now seemed to watch him with a hint of unease. Ethan's observations only fueled his determination. In quiet moments, he replayed every overheard word, every strange interaction, searching for clues. At times, he doubted himself, wondering if he was overreacting, if his suspicions were a product of his resentment toward their arrangement. But then he'd remember Delphine's voice, the matter-of-fact way she dismissed him as manageable, and the anger would return. His resolve hardened during a dinner one evening when Delphine, unprompted, began discussing their public image. "It's important we maintain consistency," she said, her tone measured. "If anyone asks, we need to project unity." Ethan nodded, but his grip on the silverware tightened. Unity. The word felt hollow, a facade she demanded for appearances while plotting something he couldn't yet see. As the days passed, the house's silence became oppressive, each interaction with Delphine layered with unspoken tension. Ethan felt as though he were navigating a maze, the walls closing in around him. He spent his nights pacing his room, formulating plans he wasn't yet ready to act on. Confronting Delphine would come, but not yet. Not until he had enough to force her to tell the truth. The weight of the situation bore down on him, but he clung to the reasons he'd agreed to this arrangement in the first place. His grandmother's health had improved significantly since Delphine had stepped in, and the financial burden that had once consumed him was now a memory. Yet the cost of that relief felt heavier than he had anticipated. The question he couldn't shake was whether he could endure the next 2 years knowing he was just another piece in her strategy. For now, Ethan resolved to keep playing along, though every passing day chipped away at his patience. He had been pulled into Delphine's world with promises of mutual benefit, but it was clear she had brought him here for reasons far beyond what she had shared. If she thought of him as docile, as someone she could control, then she had underestimated him. Ethan might have stepped into this arrangement out of desperation, but he wouldn't remain in it without uncovering the truth. As the mansion loomed around him, pristine and cold, Ethan steeled himself for what was to come. Delphine had secrets, and he intended to find them. The challenge would be ensuring that when the time came, he would be ready to face whatever he uncovered. The house was silent that evening, the kind of silence that felt deliberate. Ethan sat in his room, the faint hum of the air conditioning his only company. Delphine had gone out to one of her meticulously planned social functions, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the weight of growing suspicion. Something wasn't right, and he could no longer ignore it. He had passed her study countless times in the weeks he'd lived in the mansion, always noting the door remained firmly locked. Tonight, it stood slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. He knew it was an opportunity he couldn't waste. Quietly, he approached, his bare feet making no sound on the polished floor. Pushing the door open, he stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the soft glow of a desk lamp. The room was everything he'd expect of Delphine, immaculate, intimidating, and curated to perfection. The shelves were lined with leather-bound books, and the walls were adorned with abstract art in muted tones. Ethan moved to the desk, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the drawers. Most contained mundane items, stationery, neatly filed invoices, and legal documents. It wasn't until he opened the bottom drawer that he found something that made his breath catch. A collection of folders, each labeled with a name. His name was among them. Pulling the folders out, he placed them on the desk and began to flip through them. The contents were shocking, detailed profiles of several young men, complete with photographs, financial histories, and personal notes. Ethan felt his stomach churn as he scanned the pages. One man had crippling medical debt from a family member's illness. Another was drowning in student loans and barely scraping by in a low-paying job. The notes in his own dossier were painfully accurate, listing his unpaid bills, his grandmother's medical needs, and even the dates of his missed payments. Ethan's hands shook as he pieced it together. This wasn't random. Delphine had specifically sought out men who were struggling, men she could exploit under the guise of generosity. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't been chosen by chance. He'd been targeted. Shoving the folders back into the drawer, Ethan closed it and left the study, his chest tight with a mix of anger and humiliation. When Delphine returned later that evening, he was waiting for her in the grand sitting room, his arms crossed and his expression stony. "You've been busy," he said as she entered, his voice low and controlled. Delphine paused, her sharp gaze assessing him. "Is there something you'd like to discuss?" "Why don't we start with the dossiers in your study," he said, his tone cutting. "The ones with my name on them. The ones detailing every mistake I've ever made and every reason I was desperate enough to agree to this sham of a marriage." For a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes, surprise, perhaps, but it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "You went through my things," she said, her voice as calm as ever. Ethan laughed bitterly. "That's your response? I invade your privacy, and all you care about is that I found out how thoroughly you invaded mine?" Delphine stepped further into the room, her posture rigid. "I won't apologize for being thorough. This arrangement required careful consideration." "Careful consideration?" Ethan repeated, his voice rising. "You didn't consider me, Delphine. You considered my weaknesses, my desperation, and you used them against me." She met his glare with an icy composure that only fueled his anger. "And yet here you are," she said evenly. "Your debts are being paid. Your grandmother is receiving the best care money can buy. Are you telling me you'd give all that up because you don't like how the decision was made?" Ethan's jaw tightened. You don't get it, do you? This isn't about the money. It's about how you manipulated me into thinking this was my choice when you'd already decided I was your best option. Delphine shrugged, her tone dismissive. And what difference does it make? You've benefited from this arrangement as much as I have. If anything, I've given you more than you've given me. The coldness of her words stung, but Ethan refused to let her see how deeply they cut. This isn't over, he said through clenched teeth. You can justify it all you want, but you crossed a line. The next morning, Ethan acted on the name he'd seen in the dossiers, a private investigator Delphine had hired. The man's office was tucked away in a modest building downtown, a far cry from the luxury Ethan had grown used to at the mansion. The PI, a grizzled man in his late 40s, didn't look up from his paperwork as Ethan entered. Let me guess, the man said without preamble. You're one of hers. Ethan frowned. What's that supposed to mean? The PI finally looked up, his expression tired but shrewd. Delphine Moreau. You're not the first guy she's had me investigate. Ethan's chest tightened. So it's true. She hired you to look into me. And a few others, the PI admitted, gesturing for Ethan to sit. She gave me a list of names and asked me to dig. Find out who was in the worst shape, who'd be easiest to approach. Ethan leaned forward, his hands balled into fists. Why would you do it? Didn't it seem wrong? The man shrugged. It's a job. She wasn't asking me to do anything illegal. Just gather information. That information wasn't yours to share, Ethan shot back, his voice filled with indignation. Look, kid, the PI said, leaning back in his chair. I get why you're upset, but she's not the only one playing this game. People like her, they've been using their money to pull strings forever. You just got caught in it. Ethan's stomach churned. The humiliation of being reduced to a file in someone else's strategy was almost too much to bear. She used me, he said quietly, more to himself than to the PI. The man sighed, his expression softening slightly. Maybe she did. But you're here now. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Ethan left the office feeling raw, his emotions a tangled mess of anger, humiliation, and determination. Delphine had gone too far, and he wasn't going to let her get away with it. Whatever her endgame was, he would uncover it, and when he did, she'd have to answer for what she'd done. Ethan paced the length of the grand sitting room, his agitation palpable in every step. The sunlight filtering through the oversized windows did nothing to soften the icy tension that gripped him. His thoughts spiraled, anger simmering under the surface as he waited for Delphine to return. When he finally heard the sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor, he turned sharply to face her. She entered the room with her usual grace, a serene expression on her face as if she had no inkling of the storm brewing inside him. Ethan, she greeted, her tone clipped but polite. What's this about? You know exactly what this is about, he said, his voice taut with restrained fury. I know what you've been doing. Delphine arched an eyebrow, unbothered by his accusation. You'll have to be more specific. Ethan took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. I know about the dossiers. The research. How you picked me because I was the easiest to manipulate. And now I hear your lawyer talking about waiting to make some kind of transactions? Care to explain? Her composed facade faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly, her expression hardening. It's irrelevant, Ethan. Our arrangement benefits us both, and that's all that matters. Irrelevant, he repeated, his voice rising. You orchestrated everything. You lied to me, used me, and now you're brushing it off like it's nothing? Delphine sighed, her patience thinning. You agreed to this, Ethan. I never hid what this arrangement was. You're benefiting from it as much as I am. If you have regrets, that's on you. He shook his head, incredulous at her audacity. I'm done with this. I'm leaving. Her expression didn't change, but her voice turned sharper. "You're free to go, Ethan. But I'd remind you of the terms of the prenup. If you leave before the 2 years are up, you'll have to repay every cent I've spent on you and your grandmother." Ethan froze, the weight of her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. "You can't be serious." "I am," she replied, her tone as cold as the room felt. "You signed the agreement. I suggest you reread it if you have doubts." The room seemed to close in around him. She had planned for every possibility, every contingency. Even if he walked away now, the financial ruin he'd tried so hard to escape would come crashing back down. "You're unbelievable," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "This isn't a partnership. It's a trap." Delphine's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Think what you want, Ethan. But before you act rashly, remember why you agreed to this in the first place." Later that night, Ethan sat in his room, the silence pressing down on him. Her words echoed in his mind, but they did nothing to quell his anger. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her plan than she was letting on. If she was willing to go this far to control him, what else was she hiding? Determined to find answers, Ethan hired a private investigator of his own. It was a move that felt both desperate and necessary, but he was past the point of caring. He needed someone who could peel back the layers of Delphine's carefully constructed world and reveal the truth she was so determined to keep hidden. The PI, a wiry man named Garrett with an unassuming demeanor, listened intently as Ethan explained the situation. "You want me to dig into her finances, her connections, her history?" Garrett asked, scribbling notes in a leather-bound notebook. "Everything," Ethan said firmly. "There's something she's not telling me, and I need to know what it is." Over the next few days, Ethan heard little from Garrett, the silence gnawing at his patience. He continued to go through the motions of his role in the arrangement, playing the part of the devoted husband while his mind churned with suspicion. Delphine seemed unfazed by their earlier confrontation, her demeanor as poised and detached as ever. When Garrett finally called to meet, Ethan felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. The two sat in a dimly lit diner, the hum of conversation around them a backdrop to Garrett's revelations. "She's in trouble," Garrett began, sliding a folder across the table. "Big trouble. Her company's drowning in lawsuits, allegations of fraud, unsafe practices, the works. If even half of these stick, she's looking at massive financial penalties and potential criminal charges." Ethan flipped through the documents, his heart sinking with every page. "And what does this have to do with me?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Garrett hesitated before speaking. "She's positioning you as a scapegoat. These transactions her lawyer mentioned? They're transfers, assets and liabilities that she's planning to move into your name. If her company goes under, you'll be the one holding the bag." The blood drained from Ethan's face as the reality of Garrett's words sank in. "She's setting me up," he said quietly, his voice shaking. "She's been planning this the entire time." Garrett nodded grimly. "It looks that way. She's covering her tracks, making sure if everything falls apart, it's you who takes the fall." Ethan sat back in the booth, his mind reeling. The anger that had been simmering inside him erupted into full-blown rage. He had known she was manipulative, but this went far beyond anything he had imagined. She wasn't just using him, she was sacrificing him to save herself. The walk back to the mansion felt like a blur, his thoughts a storm of betrayal and desperation. Every interaction with Delphine replayed in his mind, each moment taking on a sinister edge he hadn't noticed before. By the time he reached his room, he was trembling with fury. Ethan knew he couldn't confront her without a plan. She was too calculating, too prepared for him to act impulsively. But he also knew he couldn't let her win. If she thought she could ruin him to save herself, she had underestimated just how determined he could be. Sitting at his desk, Ethan began to piece together a strategy. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom anymore. He was fighting to expose her for who she truly was. And this time, he wouldn't rest until he had the upper hand. The door to Delphine's office creaked as Ethan pushed it open, his hands gripping a thick folder filled with damning documents. Delphine sat behind her polished mahogany desk, her expression calm as she reviewed papers under the glow of a desk lamp. The flicker of surprise in her eyes when she looked up was brief, replaced almost instantly by her usual steely composure. "Ethan," she said smoothly, setting her pen down. "This is unexpected." He stepped inside, his pulse steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "I thought we should talk," he said, his voice firm. Delphine gestured to the chair opposite her. "By all means." Ethan didn't sit. He dropped the folder onto the desk with a heavy thud, papers spilling out. Legal documents, financial records, and correspondence from her lawyer and the private investigator lay before her. Delphine glanced down, her expression unreadable as she took in the incriminating evidence. "You've been busy," she remarked, leaning back in her chair. "Not as busy as you," Ethan replied, his tone cutting. "Fraud, lawsuits, transferring assets into my name without my knowledge. You were going to let me take the fall for everything, weren't you?" Delphine's calm facade cracked, her jaw tightening. "You misunderstand." "Don't," Ethan snapped. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this isn't exactly what it looks like. You used me, Delphine. You preyed on my desperation, manipulated me into this sham of a marriage, and planned to leave me holding the bag when everything came crashing down." She straightened, her gaze sharpening. "And what exactly do you plan to do with all of this, Ethan? Go to the authorities? Expose me to the media? Let me remind you that you've benefited from this arrangement just as much as I have." "I know what I agreed to," Ethan said, his voice rising. "I agreed to help you protect your company, not to be your scapegoat. You crossed a line, and now I'm done." Delphine's lips pressed into a thin line as she studied him, her mind clearly working through possible counterplays. "If you walk away now," she said carefully, "you forfeit everything. The prenup is clear, you leave with nothing unless the 2 years are completed." Ethan leaned forward, bracing his hands on the desk. "I'm not walking away empty-handed. You're going to void the prenup and sign over the money you've already given for my grandmother's care. In return, I'll walk out of here and keep your secrets." "And if I refuse?" Delphine asked, her voice low and measured. Ethan's eyes didn't waver. "Then I take all of this," he said, gesturing to the papers, "to the media and the authorities. Your board, your clients, and the world will see exactly who you are. You can't afford another scandal, and you know it." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Delphine's icy composure wavered as the weight of his words settled. Her entire empire, built on decades of control and calculated moves, was on the verge of collapse. Ethan had played his hand perfectly, and they both knew it. Finally, she exhaled, the sound heavy with resignation. "You've learned a thing or two about power," she said, her voice tinged with something that almost resembled admiration. "Very well. I'll agree to your terms." Ethan straightened, his stance still wary as Delphine opened a drawer and retrieved a fresh sheet of paper. She scrawled out an addendum to their prenup, voiding the 2-year clause and confirming that all financial agreements made prior to this moment would remain in effect. After signing, she slid the paper across the desk and handed him the pen. "Your turn," she said. Ethan read the document carefully, ensuring there were no hidden clauses or tricks. Satisfied, he signed his name and set the pen down. For the first time, a flicker of relief crossed his face, though it was tempered by the weight of what had brought him here. Delphine leaned back in her chair, watching him with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and detachment. "I underestimated you," she admitted. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for." Ethan met her gaze, his voice steady. "You shouldn't have underestimated me at all." He left her office without another word, the signed document safely tucked into the folder under his arm. As he walked through the mansion one last time, he felt an unexpected lightness. The grandeur of the house, once so oppressive, no longer held any power over him. The cab ride back to his modest apartment was quiet, the city lights blurring into streaks through the window. By the time he arrived, he already had a plan for the money Delphine had reluctantly agreed to let him keep. The first step was paying off his grandmother's medical bills, ensuring she could continue her treatments without worry. The second was clearing his own debts, freeing himself from the financial chains that had weighed him down for years. In the weeks that followed, Ethan resumed his life with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in a long time. He threw himself into his medical internship with renewed focus, no longer distracted by the crushing stress that had once consumed him. He visited his grandmother often, her laughter a reminder of why he had fought so hard to break free. One evening, as he sat in the small but comfortable apartment he now called home, Ethan reflected on the whirlwind of the past year. He had entered into the arrangement with Delphine out of desperation, willing to sacrifice his principles for the promise of financial stability. But through the twists and betrayals, he had learned something far more valuable: his integrity wasn't for sale, no matter the price. The memory of Delphine lingered, not as a villain in his story, but as a complex figure who had taught him the importance of self-respect and resilience. He didn't hate her; in some ways, he pitied her. She had built her life on control and power, yet it had left her isolated and vulnerable. Ethan had escaped that fate, and for that, he was grateful. Looking out the window at the bustling city below, he felt a quiet sense of peace. He had reclaimed his life on his terms, and he intended to keep it that way. Desperation had brought him to Delphine's doorstep, but strength had carried him away from it. That, he realized, was the lesson he would carry forward.